Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in hot and humid Baytown, Texas. But there's AC in my office, and so that makes everything okay. We've been looking at great chapters of the Bible, and we've already looked at three great chapters: Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and Genesis 3. We saw how God created everything, including his crowning creation, mankind, and how God had provided for man in marriage in Genesis chapter 2. And then in Genesis chapter 3, sadly, we find the fall of man, his great sin, his disobedience to God. And since then, things just got worse and worse. When sin infiltrated mankind, it just began to go worse and worse until finally God decided that he was going to start afresh. He was going to cleanse the earth by a great flood. That flood occurs in Genesis chapter 6 through 9, and it would have been fascinating to go back and look at those chapters and think about how God had begun anew with just one man and his family, Noah, who would freshen again life on the earth. But remember back in Genesis 3, in verse 15, where there's a hint of a coming Savior, where as God is dealing with the mistakes, the sins of Adam and Eve, he tells the serpent that he's going to be dealt a crushing blow by the seed of woman. Remember that? Well, we don't have any more information about that until we finally get to Genesis chapter 12. The next revelation about this coming seed of woman comes to a man named Abram, who's living in the land of Ur, perhaps modern-day Iraq. And from here, the Bible is going to focus more tightly on the family from whom the Messiah springs. But before we get to Abram, let's talk a little bit about his background. Let's look at his family tree. We're going to look at Genesis 12 in just a moment, but we're going to start in Genesis chapter 11. Let's begin reading in verse 27. It says, "These are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran, and Haran became the father of Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Sarai was barren. She had no child." Now we'll stop there for a moment. Terah's family tree might have looked something like this. He was the descendant of Shem, who himself was the son of Noah, and Terah, we're told, begins having sons at 70 years old. Now, 70 years old may seem to us old to start having children, but remember, if you've read through Genesis chapter 5, it tells us about the incredibly long lives of Abram's ancestors. And some of them became fathers when they were hundreds of years old. So apparently for Terah to start becoming a father when he was a septuagenarian is apparently no big deal. They had not lives that were quite as long as those in Genesis chapter 5. Their lifespans had been greatly reduced, but they still lived for a long time. We find where later on Sarai is identified as a daughter of Terah. Now, it's not here, but that's going to become important later on, and we'll talk about why in just a little bit. And marriage within family groups apparently seemed to have prevailed among the patriarchs. Abram married his half-sister, Sarai, and we'll see where he kind of twists that later on. In fact, later on in the story, we'll find that out. But notice something with me. It tells us in verse 28 that Haran died. Lot's father died. And maybe that kind of sets the scene why later on it seems that Abram takes Lot under his wing, so to speak, and helps provide for him, helps protect him. Abram is playing the role almost of Lot's father later on. But we also find something equally interesting. Verse 30 is a very short sentence. It simply tells us that Sarai was barren and she had no children. And that's going to set the scene for the miracle that we're going to see later on of her child, Isaac, which will follow some 25 years later. In verse 31 of Genesis 11, it says, Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan, and they went as far as Haran and settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, it tells us that Terah decided to leave Ur of the Chaldeans and go, eventually, it tells us that he wanted to go to Canaan, but he didn't. Instead, he goes to Haran first and settles there. Now, there are a couple of things that we don't know. First of all, if Ur was in the southern part in modern Iraq as we know it now, it would have been about a 600-mile trip to go north to Haran. There's another place where Ur, the region of Ur, might have been. That's a lot closer. You see it there on the map. But most scholars think that Ur was a spot that's down south, and that's quite a trek for somebody just to decide to go. We don't know why Terah wanted to go to Canaan, but ended up in Haran. And further, if he wanted to go to Canaan, there would have been a much quicker and easier route to take, more directly. We don't know why he took this out of the way route to Haran. Whatever the reason, it tells us that they settled there at the end of verse 31. Now, there's a lot that's implied in the phrase settled there. Haran became home for them. There would have been cultural and religious influences that would have found their way into Terah's family. Like most places, it was a hotbed of false religion and idolatry. And that makes the story of what's going to happen to Abram even more amazing. Well, let's read about Abram's call to Canaan. In chapter 12, in the first few verses, it says, Now Yahweh said to Abram, Go forth from your country, and from your relatives, and from your father's house, to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, there are a lot of blessings here that God offers to Abram, but those blessings begin with a directive. He tells him, go forth from your country. Now, remember, they were living in Haran at this time. God instructed Abram to leave Haran and all the things that were keeping him there. Leaving homeland and family was a much greater decision in a traditional society as what Abram had lived in than in today's much more mobile, individualistic culture. People then rarely left their villages, let alone their country, and moved to a different one. He would be leaving a familiar culture, language, traditions, home, relatives, and certainly religion. God was commanding Abram to leave everything that he held dear. Now, the promises that God makes to Abram are usually condensed into three: the land, the nation, and the seed promise. It's called the seed promise because of how it's referred to in Genesis chapter 22 and verses 17 and 18. But in actuality, there are several promises here. Let's look at some of them. First of all, he promises Abram that there will be a land that I will show you. Now, the promise of land was intended to provide Abram's descendants a physical homeland where they could live in harmony with God later on. Now, the promise of land then spoke to the need for security, for peace, for belonging, for a home. And it looked forward to God's people participating in a rest. Not long ago here at the Eastside Church, we had gone through a study of the book of Joshua. And in the book of Joshua, several times, the word rest is used to refer to that which God had promised the Israelites in that promised land. There they would find rest. God also promised Abram that not only would he take them to a land that he would show them, he says, I will make you a great nation. Now back in Genesis chapter 10, it described to us of how the descendants of Noah had spread out and established nations all over the place. God's promise to Abram shows his narrowing of focus to a certain line of humans that descend from Abram that would carry forth the promise of this one who would come to deliver that crushing blow to the serpent's head. Remember that from Genesis chapter 3 and in verse 15? He says, I'm going to make you a great nation. Now don't forget, before we had read that Sarai, his wife, was barren. She had no child, and there were no prospects of her having any children. So these promises to Abram are beginning probably to him to sound more and more fantastic. Well, God continues. He says, not only will I show you a land, not only will I make you a great nation, he says, I will bless you. Now, God's promise to bless Abram implies that God is going to somehow intervene in Abram's life for good. That we certainly see in the promise to make him a great nation. There's going to definitely have to be some divine intervention if he's going to become a great nation. But certainly that would be a blessing. Any children for Abram would be a blessing. A place to call his own, a homeland, would be a blessing. God says, I'm going to intervene. I'm going to step into your life, and I'm going to bring you good things. It's a promise to Abram. God continues and says, I will make your name great. Now, to be given a great name is not only to have a good reputation, but it's also to have a secure identity. Back in Genesis chapter 11, we read about some tower builders at a place called Babel who wanted to make a name for themselves, but it ended up where all they did was provide for themselves a monument to their folly in rejecting God. Well, what God is promising Abram is that you're going to have this identity. You're going to have this reputation, and it's going to be a good one. And his reputation, his good name, would come from his obedience to God. That's what we find all over the New Testament, especially in Romans chapter 4 and in Hebrews chapter 11 and in James chapter 2. We find where it was Abram's obedience to God that secured his identity and cemented his relationship with God. He goes further and he says, you shall be a blessing. Now, the first four promises lead to this fifth one. I will take you to a land. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. And finally, he says, you will be a blessing. Abram was to be a blessing to others by the obedience that he would offer. In Genesis 22 and in verse 18, it tells us, as God speaks to Abram, in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. Because Abram decided to do what God said. That would be the identity. And that would be the basis of blessing for all mankind. And so through this one man, God would channel all his blessings, all his good intention for men. Now we're starting to see a tightening of the focus that's going to follow Abram's descendants all the way through the Old Testament until we finally get to the seed of woman in the New Testament. Well, what was Abram's response? Let's read about it. Genesis 12, beginning in verse 4, says, So Abram went forth as Yahweh had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Remember, Lot's father had died. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his nephew, and all their possessions which they had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land as far as the side of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. Yahweh appeared to Abram and said, To your descendants I give this land. So he built an altar there, and to Yahweh, who had appeared to him. Then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to Yahweh, and called upon the name of Yahweh. And Abram journeyed on, continuing toward the Negev. What was Abram's response to all these fantastic promises of God? Immediate obedience. He just did what God said. I want you to look at this map for a moment, and he'd already traveled 600 miles or so with his father to go settle in a new place, and now he travels about another 400 to go to this place that he'd never been before, where God told him to go. He went. There's no quibbling, at least as far as we know of. There's no reasoning. There's no bargaining with God. There's no trying to find a closer place. There's just obedience. And it's the same kind of language that we find that commended Noah before. In Genesis chapter 6, it says that Noah did all the things that God commanded him. It's the same kind of thing that we're going to find later with Moses in Exodus chapter 40, where it tells us that Moses did all things that Yahweh commanded him. That's the language of God commended people. And it's certainly the kind of language that commends Abram to us in this passage. He simply obeyed. So how did he do it? How did he just take his nephew with him, all his possessions, all the people who were in his household, and just go? Well, here's how he did it. Hebrews chapter 11 tells us he did it by faith. Verse 8 says, By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Now, obviously, Abram knew that something was divinely up. And though he didn't know exactly where God was taking him, or how he was going to bring all these wonderful promises to pass, I mean, after all, he was no spring chicken himself, right? He was 75 years old when he gets up to make this foot trip 400 miles away from Haran to Canaan. And still, he believed God by faith. When God said go, he went. By faith, he obeyed. He believed it, and it was that belief that prompted his obedience and further cemented this relationship with God that would be his for the rest of his life. James chapter 2 and verse 23 puts it this way. The scripture was fulfilled, which says, And Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. Now, where it says Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, that's a quote from Genesis 15 and verse 6. And I don't want us to miss something here. I don't want us to miss how important it is for us to be able to apprehend for ourselves the blessings and the promises that God makes to us. Just as Abram had to obey God in order to seize upon the coming to pass of those promises that God had made to him. The same is true for you and me. In Romans chapter 4, it says in verses 23 and 24, Now not for his sake only was it written that it was credited to him, but for our sake also, to whom it will be credited as those who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. Now Paul is saying, as he speaks about the faithfulness of Abram, he says it's not just about Abraham's faith, it's about those who he says earlier in chapter 4, follow in the steps of Abraham, follow in his footsteps, follow in the ways of Abraham, the obedient ways of Abraham. Abraham's faith helps us to benefit if we have the same kind of obedient faith that he had. Now, later on in Genesis chapter 12, in verse 6, it tells us that Abram gets to this place called Shechem, and there God repeats this promise to Abram. There in verse 7, God repeats it. He says, to your descendants I will give this land. And so Abram built an altar there to Yahweh who had appeared to him. Now this place, Shechem, is a strategic site. It's in the heart of Canaan. And it was in the heart of what was a hotbed of idolatry. For the Israelites later on, it's going to be a place of decision. Moses tells them, before they get into the promised land, that it would be the place where they would be able to choose for themselves either blessings from God or the curses of disobedience. And in Joshua, that's exactly what happens. Abram chose God, and he built for himself an altar there. He kind of plants a flag in the ground for God in this idolatrous land. He moved a little further south, we're told in Genesis chapter 12 and in verse 8, and in verse 9 he goes even further south towards this place called the Negev. The Negev just means the south. And he apparently intends to settle there. Interesting, when you follow Abram through his travels, it seems the only structures he left behind, he didn't leave any long-standing buildings, any structures that would indicate that he was there, other than the altars that he built at these various places. So Abram has decided to obey God. He gets the call, and God says, through you, I will hone in on the promises of land, of nation, and descendants. The descendants through whom will come one great descendant. He says, through you, I will bless all the earth. Everything seems great, right? Until it seems as though the promise is threatened. In Genesis 12, beginning in verse 10, let's read. It says, now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came about, he came near to Egypt, and he said to Sarai his wife, see now, I know that you are a beautiful woman, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you. It came about when Abram came into Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Therefore he treated Abram well for her sake, and gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants and female donkeys and camels. And we'll stop there for a moment. Notice, first of all, how it says that Abram was facing a famine. So naturally he wants to do something. He wants to go to where the food is. So he goes down to Egypt, and it says to sojourn there. And that's good. It tells us by the word sojourn that he wasn't intending to stay there. He was just going to go there for a while and apparently return back to Canaan when the famine was alleviated some. But a lot of people criticize him for moving down to Egypt. After all, they say, if he believed in God's promise, wouldn't he also believe that God would somehow provide for him throughout this famine? And further, we see where Abram lied about his sister being, or rather his wife being his sister. He says, "Please say that you're my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you." Now, I said that was a lie, and it was, sort of. We find in chapter 12 and in chapter 20 and in verse 12 where the same kind of situation happens with another fella. This time he's not a Pharaoh. Back over in Genesis 20, he's a fella named Abimelech. But there, Abram said, "She actually is my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife." Remember what we talked about at the beginning here, where apparently it was acceptable to in those patriarchal families to marry within the family. So he married his half sister, is what's going on. But he wanted her to say that she was his sister instead of his wife, so that they wouldn't kill him. Now, let's just ask ourselves something. Is Abram really being faithless at this point? A lot of people would criticize him for being a coward, for trying to tell this half-truth, as it were, to kind of save his own skin. So was he being faithless? Well, maybe. Or maybe he was taking things into his own hands in order to preserve the promise. After all, he couldn't very well become the father of a great nation if his wife, the woman whom he's married to, was taken by someone else and he was killed, would he? Now, this may be the first attempt of others we'll see later on in the book of Genesis concerning Abram and Sarah's attempts to help God in bringing about his promise. I want you to see, God didn't need any help. In Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 17, it says, "But Yahweh struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. Then Pharaoh called Abram and said, 'What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say to me, she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? So then, here is your wife. Take her and go.' And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, that they escorted him away with his wife and all that belonged to him." Now, prompted by the plagues, Pharaoh realizes his blunder, and not only does he return Sarai to Abram, but he kicks Abram and Sarai out of the land. "Get out of here," they say, and make sure that they leave by having his men escort them away. So God didn't need any help. And whether or not Abram was faithless, we still see that God is going to do whatever it takes to maintain his promise. God says in the book of Isaiah in chapter 55 that his word will not go forth from him without accomplishing what it is he desires. And that was certainly true with these promises of Abram. That's one reason why Genesis chapter 12 is such an important chapter, why it's one of the great chapters. But there are a couple of other reasons as well, reasons that we can identify with. First of all, think about this. God chose humans, frail, weak, faulty humans, to be the vehicles for his promise. And nowhere do we see that more than with Abram. Now later on we'll see he's got some other faults, and so do his descendants as well. But if Abram was being weak in faith at this point, well, who couldn't identify with him? Who of us might not have done the same kind of thing? Don't think, though, that you're not as good as, or even better than Abram. You're a human just like he was. And just like God could work through Abram, God can work through you. Perhaps you can be a blessing to others as well. Second, realize this. God doesn't need help. If He promises something, it'll come to pass. Period. Your job, like Abram's, is just to obey, even when the promise seems a little bit out there. I mean, think of how fantastic these promises must have seemed to Abram. And think of how difficult it might have seemed to him to not only understand, but to comply with the directives that were given to him. See, our job is not necessarily to understand everything or to know for sure how God is going to bring all this about. Our job is just to trust Him and to do what He says, knowing that what He says will come to pass. I like to say that we just need to be a Nike commercial. Just do it. If God says it, just do it. God never tells us to do anything that ultimately and in the long run is for our best, our good, and for His glory. Thanks for joining us in this Genesis chapter 12, one of the great chapters of the Bible. And I hope you'll catch us next time as we explore another great chapter of the Bible. Thanks for joining us. God bless you.